August in Fergus County, Montana, and the heat comes off the stubble in waves you can see. On one side of the fence line, the ground is bare, chewed down to gray sticks, 40 acres of one clean, certified variety drilled in rows straight as a rule, and now eaten to the dirt by a bug that rode in on the dry wind. On the other side of that same fence stands a field that has no business being alive. Wheat and barley and peas and something low and broad-leafed, all tangled together, none of it matching, none of it ripening even. The kind of messy patchwork the seedmen laughed at back in spring. Grace Halverson walks the margin between the two in her father's old boots, a scarred green notebook in one hand, and she does not say a word. Behind her, 4 pickups have pulled off the county road. The men who lined up at the elevator to call her field a mongrel are standing at the wire now, hats in their hands, looking at the one crop in the whole county that the pest and the drought could not bring down. Nobody is laughing today, and every one of them is turning over the same question she can see in their faces. Why is the field nobody planted right the only field still standing? She knows the answer. It is written in that notebook, in her grandfather's hand, and then in her own. But to understand what she kept alive, you have to go back. Back to the spring after her father died, when a bank letter and a bare cupboard put one strange idea in her head. If you have ever been told your idea was worthless, stay with this one. Subscribe so you do not miss how it turns. And tell us where you are watching from. The spring of 2019 came slow to the flats north of Lewistown, and Grace Halverson buried her father in ground still half frozen. Harold Halverson had worked the same 320 acres of dryland wheat for close to 40 years, and he had worked them alone since her mother left. Grace came home from the city to sort what he left behind. In the machine shed, under a coffee can of bent nails, she found the notebook. Green cardboard cover, soft at the corners, the spine held with tape gone yellow. She sat on the grain drill and opened it. Her grandfather's hand filled the first pages, slanted and small, and then her father's blockier print carried it on. Every year had 2 columns. On the left, what got planted and where. On the right, what came through and what did not. Which field the rust took. Which field the sawflies cut. Which strip the grasshoppers stripped in the dry summer of 1988, and which strip beside it they left standing green. She read until the shed went dark. One line near the back sat alone, underlined twice in her father's pencil. The mixed ground never failed us. She did not know yet what he meant by it. Outside, the bank letter waited on the kitchen table, and the price of wheat had fallen through the floor. She closed the cover, pressed the taped spine flat under her thumb, and stood a long while in the doorway, looking out at the bare fields where nothing had come up yet. By the middle of May 2019, Grace Halverson had done the thing that set the whole county talking. She had taken 5 kinds of seed, 2 wheats, a barley, field peas, and a low spreading flax, and run them through the drill together on the same 20 acres her father called the home quarter. The seedmen at the Central Montana elevator watched her back the truck to the scale with the bags already half emptied and mixed. Wes Tolliver, who sold certified variety by the ton and had a chart on his wall of which one yielded best, leaned on the counter and grinned. "You mixin' hog feed or plantin' a crop?" he said. The men by the coffee pot laughed. Her nearest neighbor, Dale Renner, farmed a clean, single variety in rows so even you could sight a rifle down them, and he had pulled in behind her. He looked out the window at her field, coming up in green streaks and clumps, no 2 plants the same height, and shook his head slow. "Your dad drilled straight," Renner said. "That out there is a mess, Grace. Elevator won't know what to call it." She did not argue. She paid for her fuel, folded the receipt into the green notebook, and drove the gravel home with the dust rising behind her. That evening she walked the ragged field alone, knelt where the flax and the peas tangled low under the taller wheat, and opened the notebook to a blank page. She uncapped her father's pencil and began to write down the date, the varieties, and the exact spot where each one, late July of 2019. And the home quarter told the truth on Grace Halverson before she could tell it herself. She walked the rows at first light with the green notebook under her arm and stopped where the field had gone wrong. One of the two wheats, a tall spring variety she had thrown in for straw, had shot up past everything else and thrown a roof of shade across the ground. Under it, the flax lay pale and spindly. The field peas ran thin and yellow. The barley never filled its heads. She knelt and pulled a flax stem. It came up soft in her fingers, no seed on it worth the name. The tall wheat had grabbed the light and the early water and left the short crops starving in the dark below. She had blended them the way her grandfather's line told her to blend, and she had matched none of it. Heights, root depth, the week each one reached for the sun, she had guessed at every part. When she ran the combine through in August, the hopper filled slow and dirty, green flax trash choking the sieves, the sample graded low enough that the elevator docked her hard. Wes Tolliver waited, and this time said nothing at all, which sat on her worse than the laughing had. That night she sat under the bank letter at the kitchen table and wrote the loss down plain, the date, the 5 varieties, the tall one that choked the rest. Of the 20 acres she had drilled, barely 6 made a crop worth hauling. Harvest of 2020 caught Grace Halverson between 2 clocks. She had matched heights this time, kept every plant near the same reach for the sun, and the home quarter came up even and full. What she had not fixed was the calendar. The barley went golden and hard by the first week of August, its heads bent and ready to shatter, while the winter wheat drilled beside it still stood green and milky, weeks from ripe. She idled the combine at the field edge and watched the trap close. Cut now, and the wheat came off soft and spoiled in the bin. Wait, and the barley shelled itself onto the dirt, a whole seed crop lost to the wind before the header ever reached it. She ran it late and split the loss. Near 1/5 of the barley on the ground, the wheat sample damp and docked at the scale. That night she noted it in the green notebook, the 2 ripening dates 3 weeks apart, and underlined one word: timing. The answer came from town. At the Lewistown Library, Margaret Poe, who had shelved county farm records for 30 years, set a stack of brittle extension bulletins on the table and said nothing. Old Maslin pages, wheat and barley sewn together for 1,000 years, and one line Grace read twice. The blends that lasted were the ones whose seed came ripe on the same day. Her grandfather had known it. She had missed it by 3 weeks. How close did the varieties have to fall before the field would let her cut it whole? Rain came all through June of 2021, the kind the flats north of Lewistown rarely see, and by July, a rust had settled into the wheat across the county. Grace Halverson found it first on Dale Renner's side of the fence. His single variety stood in rows, straight as ever, but the leaves had gone orange and streaked, pustules breaking under her thumb when she rubbed one, spores yellowing her skin. She stepped over to her own ground and knelt in the blend. The disease was there too, on the one wheat that matched Renner's. But it went no further. The barley beside it stood clean, and whatever fit the one plant found nothing it could use in the next. She opened the green notebook and wrote the date, the 2 fields, and the word she underlined: stalled. Emmett Kjos, who had farmed alongside her father for 30 years and had not spoken to her since the funeral, drove up the field road that evening and got out without a word. He walked the mixed rows to the far end, turned, and walked them back. He stopped once to bend a barley head between his fingers. He looked at the orange ruin across the fence, then at the green standing on her side. He got back in his truck, put a hand up off the wheel, and pulled away, with the dust closing red behind him. A letter with the green stripe of the federal crop program waited in the mailbox out by the county road, and Grace Halverson read it standing in the March wind of 2022. The adjuster's words were plain. A field drilled to more than one variety, more than one crop, did not meet the uniform stand rule the insurance was written on. They named her blend a weed and volunteer problem. She had until the 1st of June to plant one certified variety and clean rows or lose coverage on the home quarter, the last thing standing between her and the bank. She folded the letter into the green notebook and drove to the office in Lewistown. The man behind the desk was young and sorry and could not bend the rule. "It is written for one seed and one field," he said. "Nobody wrote it for what you are doing." Then the rain quit. Through April and into May, not 1 inch fell on the flats. The stock dams drew down to cracked mud, the winter wheat came up short and pale, and by the middle of June a cutworm moth hatch rolled north across the county heavier than the old men could recall. Dale Renner sprayed his clean acres twice and watched them thin anyway. Grace stood at the gate with the letter folded in one hand and a fistful of mixed seed in the other, the deadline gone by, the dry wind pushing at her back. She looked a long time at the field they had called ineligible, then walked to the drill, and by August of 2022, the flats north of Lewistown had gone the color of bone. The cutworm larvae the June moths had laid were up and feeding, and they moved through the county field by field, the way fire runs through dry grass. Grace Halverson watched them take Dale Renner's wheat first. One variety, one height, one shade of green the worms could read from the road. And they crossed it in even lines, leaving the stalks chewed to gray stubs. He sprayed a third time. The dry wind carried it off before it fell. By the middle of the month, his home quarter stood as bare stubble. They reached her fence and broke against it. Grace knelt in the blend at first light and turned a leaf. The worms had found the one wheat that matched Renner's and stripped it, plant by plant, down her rows. Between those plants stood barley they would not touch, a durum they passed over, a low pea vine that broke their line. The feeding front hit a plant it could not use and stopped there, hunting for the next host 3 feet on. She wrote the date, the 2 fields, and the word the notebook had taught her long before she believed it. Dilution. That summer, the worms and the dry wind together took near 24 of the county's clean quarters down to bare dirt. Of the mixed 20 acres they had named a weed, she lost fewer than 1 plant in 5. Word ran the section roads faster than any letter, and by the last week of August of 2022, the trucks began pulling up along Grace Halverson's fence line. They came to see the one green field in a burned county. Curtis Lund, the extension breeder down from Bozeman, walked the blend row by row with a hand lens, crouching to count the worm scars on the durum, the barley, the low flax she had drilled between them. He straightened at the far end and looked back down the standing rows. "You lost the one wheat and held everything else," he said. "That is the whole trick, right there in the dirt." Then a gray truck she knew nosed in behind the others. Ray Tolliver, the seed dealer who had called her ground a mongrel patch at the elevator 3 springs back, climbed down slow and pushed his hands into his pockets. He studied the green a long while. "How did you match it?" he asked, quiet, none of the elevator left in his voice. How do you know what to put together?" Grace drew the green notebook from her coat and turned to a page thick with dates and heights. She did not read it aloud. She held it open so he could see her father's columns, the varieties, the day each one headed out, the ones that stood when their neighbors went down. "You do not pick what wins," she said. "You pick things that fail at different times." Tolliver said nothing. He took the cap off his head in the dust and held it against his chest. Down the fence, the men who had laughed for 3 years stood in the gray stubble and stared at the green. What was there left for any of them to say? By the thaw of 2023, the trucks came back to Grace Halverson's fence, and this time they carried empty sacks in the beds. Curtis Lund had driven a folder of photographs to a program office in Great Falls that winter, her standing rows set against the county's burned stubble. And by March, the rule that had named her ground a weed problem was struck. A diversified stand went into the paperwork as a covered practice. The letter that reached her that spring spelled her home quarter out by legal description, the ground that had made the case. Farmers who had driven past her patch for 3 springs now stood in her yard with pencils, asking what she had drilled and where. She sold them no bag of seed. She sat them at the kitchen table with the green notebook open and read the columns aloud, the heading dates, the heights, the varieties that failed in different weeks, so no single trouble could take them all at once. Dale Renner came last, cap in his hands, and copied her numbers onto the back of an elevator receipt. By seeding time, near a dozen quarters north of Lewistown went in his blends. The bank quit its circling and let the note ride another year. Grace stood at the gate at dusk and watched the drills crawl the far fields, each one laying down more than one kind of seed, the clean single rows of the seed company map broken for good across the flats, dust rising gold behind the tractors as the light went down. On a still morning in the spring of 2023, Grace Halverson filled her palm with the last of the seed she had saved through the winter. Hard red wheat, barley, a pale durum, a few flat peas, a scatter of flax, all rolled together the way her father's people had carried them west in a coffee tin. No single kind ever trusted to stand alone. She closed her fist around the mix the way she had that first cold morning years back, when the men at the elevator laughed and called it a mongrel patch. She knew now what the field had been for all along. Her father had never chased the biggest number. Page after page of the green notebook was a plain record of what failed and in what week, so that no one dry wind or hungry summer could reach every plant at once. The mixed ground never won the county fair. It simply refused to lose everything in a single bad year. She walked out and let the seed run from her hand across the worked dirt, wheat beside barley, beside pea, the drill idling at the field edge. A meadowlark called from a fence post. The air smelled of turned earth and rain still an hour off. Here is what her father had written inside the cover, and what she had come to believe. A field that is all one thing has nothing left to fall back on. Strength was never in being the same. It was in being different and standing together. If this one stayed with you, tell us in the comments about a time being the odd one out is what carried you through, and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe, and we will be back next week with another.